All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of Red Grace Live. It's good to be with you again. My name is Emilio Ramos. As always, I am joined by Michael Whitehead. Great to be back on the show with him. And today, so much to talk about, but we are going to be talking about the last gospel and exactly what does that mean. But first of all, Micah, how you doing, man? You doing okay?
I'm doing great.
Surviving?
How are you? Oh, man, this Texas
Yeah.
heat, man, it's getting to you. And then the humidity, if this humidity would just go away, I think everything would be okay.
Yeah, there was one night last week that it seemed like the darker it got, the hotter it got.
Yeah. This is not.
I just don't
This is not
understand
Arizona. This is not what I signed up for.
Yeah, exactly. And, but we'll manage. Interestingly enough, though, at least in our neighborhood, we've had some storms and it's passed over us. So we're kind of thankful for that. It's been kind of mainly either up north or down south. So we've been kind of exempt a little bit from the real bad storms,
Yeah.
And I have a friend who just got in the roofing business and he said, and so he's dealing with all the hail and everything. And he's saying, your part of town, your little neighborhood there. He's like, it hasn't gotten hit yet. So he's like, but we're coming for you. I hope not. I hope he's not coming for us. But man, so much to talk about. So many things to talk about. I know right now I'm talking to several people about transhumanism and AI because that's really taking off. Different people are coming out of the woodwork. Micah, I don't know if you saw, but different people are coming out of the woodwork. Former Google execs,
right?
Just guys that work with AI. The purported grandfather of AI just recently came out and became kind of an alarmist and
terrified.
Kind of sounding the alarm. Yeah, terrified of different things. So I don't know if you've been keeping your eye on all that.
And honestly, I only actually keep my eye on it because you have such a heavy eye on it. And every single time I talk to you, you're like, did you see this? Did you see this? Did you see this? And I'm like sitting there, finally, I'm having to like dig into it. And like, it is scary. I mean, listening to this guy who, has spent his life working on this. And now he's sitting there going, hey, let's put a pause on this. And then what the implications have for the church and how that's all going to come down the pike, good questions.
Yeah. Mo Gadot is the recent Google guy that's coming out and talking about it. He wrote a book called Scary Smart. And in that book, he talks about the different, as the way that he looks at it is that like there's three inevitables that are coming out and that, basically, AI is coming. It will be smarter than human beings and bad things will go wrong. Those are kind of his inevitables. And then he talks about how there's a potential for a lot of good. And in one recent interview, he said that the likelihood that we've all been kind of run off to a deserted island for survival, he says is very high. That's just crazy.
If you remember back to the 80s, there was a documentary that came out, and there was a little program called Skynet that kind of threw everything into an upheaval, and we got the Terminator, and that kind of really sealed the deal on Arnold Schwarzenegger's claim to fame. He was already a big deal, but now we have to have lived with him for the last 40 years. So, but it was a little bit of a scary thing there, and I could see that all coming down, and that's what we have in the next. What's scary though is it's something that could happen in the next few years or even few months. It's not that far off on the horizon. I joke whenever Terminator came out, Skynet was such a far thing in the future. But now we're looking at it and it's right on our doorstep.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, Mo Gadot is talking about how in the next few years, right? We're looking at Chat GPT and language models and stuff like that are going to be many, many, many times smarter than human beings. And eventually, as we head towards 2030, 2040, we're looking at AI being millions of times smarter than human beings, just the thought of that is sort of mind-boggling. It's sort of like, okay, that's kind of insane. And so, I think maybe the most worrisome part of what is going on there is that he and others are talking about that this has all led to basically a new arms race, and that the reason why Google and other platforms and people that are involved in AI, the reason why they're not slowing down, he says, is because of the competition. And because if they don't think of it first, or they don't develop it first, if they don't get in front of it first, who do we want to get in front of all of that first? Do we want Germany to do that? Do we want Russia? Do we want China to do that? Who do we want to be in front of that cutting edge technology? So really kind of crazy stuff. And so I'm hoping that all the years that I've invested recently pouring into transhumanism and AI and stuff like that, I'm praying and I'm hoping, I was talking with a friend today who leads a major ministry, very, very well-known ministry, and is grappling now with all these things. And now, like, daily, we're talking about articles and different things in the news that we're seeing that are, again, just kind of leveling up our awareness of what's happening. So we can go on forever, Micah, with all that. It's actually relevant to what we're talking about today, though, actually, with the last gospel. So maybe let me have the first word, and then we'll keep going on this theme.
Okay, here we go.
Well, sometime last year, I was at the Ark Encounter with Ken Ham, and I delivered a message entitled "The Last Gospel." And, funny enough, Ken Ham said, the title of your message is "The Last Gospel." I thought there was only one gospel. And so, and of course, what I meant by that was not the last as in a sequence of gospels, but I was talking about Revelation chapter 14 and the fact that there is the very last time that you find the word gospel, euangelion, in the Bible. And when you actually look at the text of Revelation chapter 14, it's interesting, but that the last gospel is really unlike any gospel that maybe you would articulate, or maybe any gospel that you hear from other people. As a matter of fact, it's very, very kind of unfamiliar what exactly the angel is saying there in terms of what the last gospel is. And so the reason why this is so important is because here we have, sort of in the book of Revelation, we have the gospel message being articulated by an angelic messenger, and yet the contents of that gospel really provoke a question as to why did the angel share the contents that he did? Why is the gospel of that angel, why does that gospel sound so different from the gospel that you and I would share? And then, of course, as you think about the context of Revelation there and what's happening, it then begins to make perfect sense that really, and the reason why I shared this at the Ark Encounter, because of course the Ark Encounter answers in Genesis. The big doctrine there, of course, is a doctrine of creationism. And what the angel is talking about in Revelation 14 is, in fact, the doctrine of creation. So I thought, in order for us to really grapple with the last gospel, we need to get into the various components of that gospel message by this angel and see how they are, and how all of that, all these different components in that Revelation text, how that is so incredibly relevant for us today, and why the message there is so important for us to understand. But we need to understand what is the angel communicating there in terms of the last gospel. And so I hope that this will be a helpful time for us to kind of wrap our brain around not only what the text is saying, but also how can we use that in our own ministry, in our own theology and evangelism. So I hope that this will be a useful time. So let's dive into the various components of this passage. All right. So, Micah, when you think about the last gospel, what comes to your mind? Just don't say anything heretical.
Well, yeah, that's where I immediately go. Honestly, I don't exactly know what you mean necessarily by that. I mean, because I understand it's the last time it's mentioned in the scripture, but what implications does that have? What does it have?
Yeah. No, exactly. I think a lot of people are quite puzzled. Matter of fact, when you even mention that to people, when you ask people, "Hey, what is the last gospel, or what does the last gospel in the Bible look like?" I think a lot of people are kind of like, "What are you even talking about?"
Deer in the headlights.
Right? What Yeah, deer in the headlights. And so, to be fair, of course, we're talking about the last time the gospel is mentioned in the Bible. And when you look at the text there, and we're definitely going to pull this up, it's in Revelation chapter 14, and it comes in the middle of an angelic message there. But Revelation chapter 14, beginning in verse 6, I think what we'll do here is we'll kind of read down to verse 8. And actually, we'll read down to verse, let's see here. We'll stop at verse 8, but verse 9 is important as well. But this is what Revelation, maybe I'll just read the text for us and then we can comment here. But in Revelation 14, beginning in verse 6, this is what it says here. It says, "I saw another angel flying in the mid-heaven, having an eternal gospel," there's the word, "to preach to those who live on the earth and to every nation and tribe and tongue and people." Interesting. And he said with a loud voice, "Fear God." So here's the components of the gospel according to the angel. "Fear God, give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the springs of water." And that's the end of his gospel. And so as you can see there, Micah, there's no mention of the cross. There's no mention of grace or forgiveness or the love of God, the resurrection. There's no mention of any of that. The features of this gospel are very strange. And so let me just read a little bit further here, verses 8 and 9, just to give a fuller context. And then he says, "And another angel, a second one, followed, saying, 'Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who has made all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her immorality.'" In verse 9, "Then another angel, a third one, followed them, saying with a loud voice, 'If anyone worships the beast and his image and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand,'" then it will go on to say, "they too will have the wrath of God, and they will have to drink of the wrath of the wine of the wrath of God," and all of that. And they will basically be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of God's holy angels and the presence of the Lamb. So it goes on to talk about all of that. But then at the end, in verse 12, it finally gets into the idea of keeping God's commandments and putting your faith in Jesus Christ, which now that sounds like the gospel, right?
Yes.
And so this is, finally we get to familiar territory where we're putting our faith in Jesus. But I want to begin with the actual gospel that the angel announces there in verses 6 and 7. Particularly today, what I want to talk about is this emphasis of the components of this angel's gospel. And the way that I see it is that it is threefold, and beginning with this point right here, Micah, and that is the creator-creature relationship and distinction. This is one of the reasons why I ended up doing this message, is because of things like transhumanism and futurism and AI and the things that we're seeing today with, the futurist dream, as it were, but also with the fact that what we're seeing in society in terms of all the false worldviews that are out there, everything we're seeing from the LGBTQ crowd, the CRT, the woke stuff, and then even further than that, everything that we're seeing in terms of globalism and postmodernism, really even going all the way to a post-human future. That's what a lot of these people are talking about, Micah. They're talking about going into a future leading up to the 20s and 40s, 2030 and 2040, that is. And that what's going to happen in that near future that's right in front of us is a lot of that is going to be radically post-human. I guess we can even talk about post-humanism at a practical level. where we are seeing the undermining of our humanity, of our humanness, even by technology right now. Technology that is making it harder and harder for us to have a human connection. I mean, there's entire books that are written on this. There's a book right now, the couple of books that I'm reading on this. One is The Shallows, and the other one is a book by Susan Greenfield, who talks about the impact of technology on your brain, like literally your physiology, everything, and that how that is leading to more and more kind of post-human ways of thinking. Everything from your teenagers being socially awkward,
right,
to the fact that in Japan you have a whole subculture of hermits that has arisen, of especially young 20 to 30 something males who have chosen to isolate themselves from the real world and preferring a virtual world or a technological world to the real. It's just very depressing.
Yeah.
But it just shows you the human disconnect and where all this is coming from. Where, it's one thing. It's like I've compared it to this, Michael. You tell me if this makes sense. But when we look at all the problems that we're facing today, it's kind of like looking at a big dam that's about to break. And there are cracks in the dam. And the way that I see the church kind of responding right now is that everyone's trying to plug their fingers in the dam. And they're trying to address individual issues, the woke issue, the postmodern issue, the LGBTQ issue, the liberal issue. But they're not realizing that behind the dam, there is something far more systemic that is at work. And so I think that one of those things really has to do with the nature of our worldview at a very fundamental level, and honestly, at the level of the creator-creature relationship and the creator-creature distinction. When you get down into the roots of our worldview, and when you do a worldview analysis, that's really what you're doing. Right. So, you know what I'm saying? So, I mean, I think you can address all the individual issues, but what stands behind everything? That's a question I have.
Well, and I think that even the church, we just, in the last, couple weeks now, it's been that the SBC convention was in New Orleans, and they had an amendment, or not an amendment, but some parliamentary thing from Robert's Rules. Thank you very much. About AI and how it plays a part in what we do in the church going forward. And I think, yay, great. They're attacking it. They're trying to get ahead of it, but I think we're still way too far behind it. Of course, last year was, woke CRT stuff. This year was women in ministry, and then this little bitty little thing about AI. And so I think most people in the church, most people just in general, just don't understand what it's going to do to life, and attacking or continuing to fight things like CRT, wokeism, and all those things that we see. Marxism is the real core to those. It's easy to see and identify what those things are. And we're sitting there, a lot of us are, because we don't have that crier or that person out there telling us this could be bad, and we need somebody to rise up and be that person.
Yeah, no doubt. And honestly, it's amazing that you mentioned that just a little bit of the SBC was devoted to AI, right, and the threat that poses. And just talking with a friend today, and I reminded him, I said, look, man, I told you a long time ago, I said, our lives are going to be swallowed up by this. I mean, maybe that's an exaggeration on my part. I would happily be guilty of doing that, of exaggerating, of being a alarmist, of being characterized as somebody that is, going overboard and blah, blah, blah. But I'm telling you, on the basis of the opinion of the leading thinkers in the field, that this is not an overstatement, that we're getting ready to see a world of absolute fake fake reality, as they call it, actually. We're getting ready to see, if you would, fakeism. Did I just invent a term? Maybe. But we're getting ready to see fakeism all over the culture. You don't know if your student wrote that essay. You don't know if you actually
Sure.
passed that test. You don't know if that author actually wrote that book. You don't know if that director actually wrote that script. You don't know if that artist actually came up with that painting. You don't know if the video editor actually did his job, or he put some kind of algorithm to work for 10 minutes while he took a nap. We're getting to that place where we just don't know, where did the humanity end and where did the AI begin. But fast forward 10 years, as they're telling us, and fakeism, I kind of like that word, so I think I'm going to go with it. But I think fakeism is kind of one of the next big characteristics of our culture. And again, if you don't think that the theology of the Bible speaks to that in the creator-creature relationship, creator-creature distinction, absolutely wrong. And so, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this, because what I believe the angel is doing in Revelation, and it's funny because I just talked to Peter Jones in the episode we did together. I brought this up to him, and he was aware of it, but I filled in a couple more, kind of connected the dots a little bit more for Peter on a couple texts that he hadn't thought about, and he's like, "You're right, that all connects." And I don't take any credit for it, because when I delivered this message at the Ark Encounter, I said, "Look, I was thinking along these lines, and then I read G.K. Beale's commentary on Revelation right at this critical juncture." And Beale actually makes that very connection, and actually helped me to see that what the angel is doing there in terms of emphasizing the creator, the doctrine of the creator, is he is reorienting pagan society, the pagan world, who has lost its grip on one of the most fundamental starting points of all epistemology, philosophy, theology, and worldviews, so that because we don't understand our relationship to the creator, we don't understand our relationship to anything else. And so when it comes to theology, it's no wonder that we're not going to know what is the relationship to technology. And man, I got to tell you, our culture is primed to embrace this entire fakeism that is upon us. And that's why, man, I'm telling you, we need to reorient our churches, and in terms of discipleship and preaching and teaching. We have to recalibrate the way that we did in the 80s and 90s, as we began to rise to the occasion and answer the bell of, postmodernism, agnosticism, existentialism. As we started to respond to that kind of liberal thought, post-Enlightenment humanism come into its own. Once again, the church needs to recalibrate so that the conversation is no longer about the tenacity of the Bible, the historicity of the Gospels, the historical accounts of Scripture. We're interestingly enough, we're into something a bit more even fundamental now. We're kind of down now into the very trenches of what is real and what is digital, what is fake, what is virtual. That's super concerning. And Micah, as I take a drink of my cup here, I want to tell people what's real. This is a real Father's Day cup, and so it's got all these cute little, I just had to show it off at least once, but it's got all these little dogs and cats, and who knows what else is on here. But yeah, anyway, so I decided to go with the Father's Day cup today.
That's
so
awesome.
People saw this, they're like, what is he drinking out of?
Well,
that's what it is right there.
Well, don't tell them about the entire collection that looks like that, though. I mean, you're blaming it.
Cupboard.
Yeah, you're blaming it on your little girl.
Cupboard in the kitchen somewhere. It's all color coded. Well, see what you did to me?
See, but the funny thing is that we've been seeing little bitty things come out of this whole "is it real" thing over the past. I mean, presidential elections. I've seen videos of Barack Obama with his mouth moving, it be his voice, but that is not him. They've done it since then to Trump. They've done it since then to Biden. It's just going to get to where it's progressing to where it's going to get to something that's, something that we can be fooled by. Because right now they're out there saying, "Hey, look at what we did. This is really cool," and it's fake. This wasn't President Obama. It wasn't anything like that. This is fake. But we're getting to the point where, bad intentions maybe come into play, where they won't be telling us what's going on, and we will be fooled, and we will have the culture moved by something that is completely made up.
Yeah, my understanding right now is that they have software that only needs about 3 seconds of your voice.
Wow.
For them to capture your voice and be able to feed it into an algorithm where they can essentially program that algorithm to say anything with your voice, so that there is a huge surge right now in elderly people being conned out of their finances because someone will call them and tell them, "Hey, this and so, you and I, we know each other from way back, and blah, blah, blah. I'm in trouble right now. Can you please wire me some money for this and that?" And elderly people, unsuspecting, and because of their age and where they're at and their state and their mental stage of life, they're easily conned into giving money away to people. That's already happened,
right?
For years. I mean, can you imagine the leverage now that a con artist has through AI to do something like this?
And
it's unbelievable.
I just heard a news story a few weeks back where a father and you and I both have daughters. A dad got a phone call from what he thought was his daughter saying, "Help, help. They've taken me hostage," and sort of like a taken kind of situation. And it was a fake. And I think he ended up wiring 100%. These people money, and there was nothing wrong with his daughter. She was perfectly fine off away at college.
100%. 100%. And so those kinds of, that's what we can talk about in terms of society coming apart, unraveling. And at some point, legislation will have to kick in to respond to all of this, to control all of this. And typically when that level of legislation has to be rolled out, you better believe it comes with all kinds of underpinnings that we have no idea what. Talk about pork barrel, legislation. I mean, you're talking about legislation that will seek to respond to this crisis, and who knows what they're going to roll out in the midst of that. So, that's why I was thinking, if this passage in Revelation. Now let's get back to eschatology a little bit,
okay?
Because if this passage in Revelation really is talking about a future eschatology. If the angel here is addressing the end of the world, the generation right before the return of Jesus Christ, and actually in G.K. Beale's commentary, he shows how that word right there, with the angel flying in the midst of the mid-heaven, the Greek word is masura nema, and masura nema is used in the book of Revelation when some sort of apocalyptic vision or an announcement is being made by a being like an angel flying in the mid-heaven that is announcing something that brings us right to the brink of the second coming. And if this is futuristic, so I'm sorry for my post-millennial preterist friends, I don't believe this is talking about 70 AD, then the other reason for that, of course, is because then he goes on to describe Babylon, which the demise of Babylon. So Revelation, just for people paying attention here, Revelation 14 verse 8 then is sort of a precursor to Revelation 17 and 18, which is a deep dive into Babylon, end time Babylon, or if you like, it is the system of Antichrist, which is destroyed by the parousia, by the second coming of Jesus. And so if this is the case, then we're looking at humanity here near the end, right prior to the parousia, and sort of the character of humanity at that point is deeply pagan. It's pagan to the point that mankind needs to be reoriented with their creator. So amazing, right? But in our fake, virtual, digital, simulation type, worldviews that are now emerging, isn't it amazing that God reorients us to the one who made heaven and earth, to the one who created the sea and the springs of water? I mean, remarkably earthy, if you would, remarkably organic, to get us back to a baseline for our worldview to understand ourselves. And so the angel, in introducing the doctrine of creation, wants to remind us that there is a God above us. And so there is the creator-creature distinction, that God is beyond us. He is above us. And because of that, God is absolutely immutable in all of his ways. God does not change. And in our fast-moving world, that's exactly what we need. Micah, Cornelius Van Til, he taught in his apologetics that what was at the very foundation of all false philosophy was this idea of mutualism, this idea of what he called correlativism. And that's the idea, essentially, of bringing God down, of humanizing God, or of bringing man up so that we deify man. So false philosophy, always, false worldviews, false religion, will always either bring God down and humanize him, or bring man up and deify him. And so you have, for example, in pagan philosophy, usually, you have a mixture of both. You have both God being very manlike. And so in Greek mythology, Greek philosophy, and Greek religion, Greek mysticism, the Greek gods, they always look like us. Their statues look just like us. They look like Herculean, they look like Herculean, bodybuilders or something, right? And therefore, there you see kind of an attempt to bring God down to the human level, to humanize God. And in other religions, you have a God who brings man up to his level. And you have that in pantheism, where essentially everything is God, including you. What's worrisome to me is that in today's evangelical climate and what's going on with theology right now, that humanization of God, that deification of man, that also is happening at the theological level as we seek to, for example, think of God as time-bound. We think of God not to, kind of bring up one theologian specifically, but, for example, John Frame. John Frame, in his systematic theology and his doctrine of God, would argue that God operates in two different modes of being, that God operates both in the mode of his absolute immutable deity, but in his essence, in his being, God can also operate in the mode of time and change. And that is, to me, that is a disastrous proposal for theology. And so that what happens there is they take anthropomorphic language and it just runs amok. They read anthropomorphic language back into the very nature of God, as if God sort of changes with us. And honestly, as we look at evangelicalism at a practical level, I don't consider myself to be an evangelical per se. I think the word evangelical at this point is so radically toxic because it's become kind of the general drip pan for everything. I mean, an evangelical is Beth Moore, an evangelical is Benny Hinn, an evangelical is Bethel, an evangelical is any wild-haired Pentecostal kind of theology. And evangelicals are also said to be, the expositors among us, the John MacArthurs among us, and the Reformed theologians among us. I just think it's become a completely sort of nonsensical word at this point that means almost nothing. And so I'm more and more and more comfortable calling myself distinctly Reformed as a Protestant Reformed Christian. But if you look at evangelicalism at large, Micah, one of the things that has emerged is sort of a radical, hyper relational view of God. And I remember standing there at the Ark Encounter and talking about how that today in Christianity, people want a God very much like ourselves. They want a God that essentially takes the ride of life with us, that's in the back seat, wondering where we're going to drive them, wondering where the GPS of life is taking us. And they want to bring God down so that God is accommodated to our lives, so that he acclimates to our change. And a lot of that, you can see that in the mystical, hyper emotional, kind of charismatic wing of the church, where God is kind of responding to us. So as we have an emotional high with God, we can rest assured that God felt that. And so that God is somehow passively taking on feeling just like we are. Wow. Well, from a confessional perspective, if you just read the confessions, right? If you look at the Westminster Confession, for example, on the Trinity, one of the things that defines God there is his impassibility. The fact that God does not have emotions the way that you and I have emotions, because God is not receiving anything. God is not passive at all. That's what Paul is talking about in Acts chapter 17. We can't serve God as though he needs anything. He doesn't need anything, Paul says. There's nothing you can give to him. There's no addition. There's no subtraction. There's no multiplication, right? In that sense, we don't contribute anything to God. We don't add anything to him. We don't enhance him in any way. God is absolutely, perfectly immutable in all of his ways. But then at the same time, we also don't fundamentally change man until man becomes like God. Does that make sense, Micah? I mean, I think when you look at evangelicalism, wouldn't you say that there's a hyper emphasis on a God that relates to you, a God that's right, a God that is right there with you and basically experiencing life with you.
Right.
I think everywhere.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I don't like to identify as an evangelical is because whenever culture, whenever the world says that, they mean it in a very pejorative sense. It's not something that is distinctive or something that will help people understand who they're exactly talking to, because they're using it as a pejorative, and it is, like you've said, it is lumping a lot of people up into the same category. But all I can think about is whenever you talk about this is the idea of, Jesus is my co-pilot, and he's just riding around with me in the truck as we're driving down the highway, and I'm sitting there going, whenever I see those stickers, I'm like going, put Jesus in the captain's chair. Don't let him just be your co-pilot. But yeah, I mean, it's everything that we see. It's like, how can God relate to me? How can we bring God down to our level so that he can comfort me? And it really ends up being just more about me than it does about actually us serving, like, in Revelation 14, where it talks about, this is who God is. He did all this stuff over here. It kind of reminds me back of, towards the end of, or at the end of Job, whenever God's like saying to Job, hey, where were you whenever I created all this? Were you there whenever, I told the water you could come this close, but no further, and I drew the line? It's a sad place where the church has gotten to where they want to be more hand reaching out, and it ends up that they end up just kind of watering down what the gospel actually is.
Yeah, and the angel is telling us that the gospel fundamentally has to do with God as creator. And so, and that's one of the reasons why I appreciate the ministry of Peter Jones so much, because he really stresses the doctrine of the transcendent creator. And honestly, like, the way that we compromise on that issue is either going to be through that sort of hyper relational, bringing God down to our level kind of Christianity, or it's going to be a very ancient and a very ancient way of arriving at the same place, and that is by bringing man up to the level of God. And you see that, for example, in Catholic theology, where if you follow Thomas Aquinas, remarkably, this is one of my big concerns with the surge in Thomistic studies today. I showed you this, Mike, at the beginning of the show, but I remember, I wanted to show this for folks to see that this book just came out. It's called The Reformation and Renewal by Matthew Barrett, and it's actually retrieving the one holy Catholic and apostolic church. And what Matthew Barrett is doing, a lot of very, very good information in here, actually. A lot of very good history and things like that. But what Matthew Barrett is doing in that book as well is he is trying to show us what is the language of retrieving. What are they talking about? When they're talking about retrieving, what they're saying is that we need to retrieve, sometimes it's called ressourcement. We need to go back to the sources of scholasticism that culminated in Thomas Aquinas for things like the doctrine of God, to understand that the Bible, that Christianity, Christendom, has a very deep, rich historical tradition revolving around the doctrine of God, the Trinity, the hypostatic union of Christ. It didn't begin at the Reformation. And what Matthew Barrett is burdened to try to show is that even the reformers were retrieving, in other words, pulling from these sources, pulling from the sources like Thomas, Peter Lombard, and others, in terms of the great, as what they call the great tradition, going all the way from Nicaea, Augustine Nicaea, and all the way up to the scholastics of the 13th and 12th, 14th century, culminating in Thomas. But the problem, the reason I bring all that up, we'll have to do a show just on that stuff. But the reason why I bring that up, Micah, is because the problem is that a book like this and others tends to minimize what is sort of a glaring problem in going to Thomas for doctrine of God, because for Thomas and doctrine of God, you're talking about Thomas's understanding of the way that God relates to man and man relates to God. And that has to do with Thomas's view of glorification or eschatology, where for Thomas, mankind, those who are saved, will be reproportioned to have a direct participation in the essence of God. And for reformers like Herman Bavinck and others, that amounted to something like pantheism. To say, wait a minute, wait a second. So this is, think about the language of the angel here. The creator of heaven and earth, the one who created everything, the ocean, the springs of water, so that the creator is set apart from us. But what Thomas is doing, in one sense, is no better than what hyper-relational theology and paganism does. By bringing God down, Thomas is trying to bring man up to a place that's too high. To a place where we as human beings end up participating in the very essence of God, and therefore we lose the transcendent distinction of God altogether, or at least you really begin to erode the foundation. Herman Bavinck called this, by the way, a melting fusion between God and man. Listen to that language, a melting fusion. And no one has done more on this, a better job on pointing much of this out recently than Lane Tipton and many of his Reform Forum lectures that he's given there in their academy, and also certain books that he's getting ready to release on this very issue here, hopefully in the near future. Which is to say, you're talking about theology books, which is to say, probably in the next 5 to 7 years. So that's
not the fast movers. Future. Yeah.
No. We're not. They're not. He's not publishing through Amazon or anything. But you know what I mean. He's done a lot of work to point all of this out. But all of that, whether it is through this sort of evangelical hyper-relational theology, or whether it is through this resurgence of Thomistic thought in a ressourcement theology that ignores the ontology of Thomas by elevating man all the way up. Both are wrong, and both undermine both the creator-creature distinction and the creator-creature relationship. But what Calvin did is he rejects what Thomas writes on that issue. As much as he was conversant with Thomas, John Calvin, he didn't teach what Thomas taught, because Calvin was not semi-Pelagian the way that Thomas was. Calvin, as you might have guessed, Micah, Calvin was a Calvinist.
Really?
Obviously, that's anachronistic, but you know what I mean. The reason why we call it Calvinism is because we deduced from the theology of what Calvin was teaching something like total depravity.
Right.
We deduced also from Calvin not just the 5 points of Calvinism, but we also deduced what he called the sensus divinitatus, the sense of the divine. And the sensus divinitatus for Calvin was the way to keep a proper understanding of the creator-creature relation and distinction, where we don't violate the transcendence of God, but we also don't minimize the relationship that he has with man. And the sensus divinitatus is saying that man has an immediate understanding both of God and himself, so that at the moment of his creation, at the moment of his birth, if you would, Adam and Eve, Adam knew himself and knew God in the same instance, in the same breath, the way that a baby cries immediately upon birth. Adam immediately knew God. He immediately knew himself. And that is the way that we understand our relationship between creator and creature. And that then begins kind of to set the groundwork for a reformed worldview of how we know God, how we know ourselves, and how we know the world around us. And I mean, there's so much there that we can get into, but if you lose this, Micah, if you lose this understanding of the creator-creature distinction and relation mediated through a sensus divinitatus, not through Roman Catholic, Thomistic, deeper Catholic conceptions, and neither through modern, liberal, mystical, sort of hyper-relational theology, then you won't know who you are. You'll lose sight on your own identity. Is there a reason why? I mean, what do you think, Micah? Do we have a crisis of identity today in the culture, in the world, even in the church?
Oh yeah. 100%.
I mean, how many young people in youth groups across America today are battling with their identity? They don't know who they are. They don't know why they're here. They don't know what their purpose is. And I've brought this up in the past, Micah, but this was so alarming to me. I did a membership interview with a family a while back now. And this young lady gave just a glorious testimony of having been gloriously saved by the Lord. But she said that when she was in college, she was so confused by the culture. This is not a joke. She said this through tears. She said she was changing her gender every week. She didn't know whether to identify as a male or a female week to week at times. She was so utterly overwhelmed with a sense of, I don't want to identify it as the wrong thing.
Wow.
Man, there's the youth of America, to say that the youth of America is in trouble is just an understatement of the century, maybe of the millennia, because they're in serious trouble because they are being offered a pagan cosmology. They're being offered a pagan worldview, basically. And what they need is to be reoriented all over again with the very fundamentals of metaphysics, which is ultimate reality. They need to be grounded in a biblical metaphysic of the creator-creature relation and distinction. This doesn't just happen. Mike, if you want to pull up Acts chapter 14, for example, this doesn't just happen in Revelation at the very end. This doctrine is useful throughout all of time. But G.K. Beale made this connection in his commentary on Revelation, and he showed that the very same thing happened in Acts chapter 14 as the Apostle Paul and Barnabas encounter the men in Lystra, as right after they see that that Paul and Barnabas are performing miracles and things like that, they seek to deify them, and they began to call Barnabas Zeus. This is verse 12. Actually, in verse 11 it says the crowd saw that what Paul had done, and it says here that let's see here, they raised their voice, saying in the Lycaonian language, the gods have become like men. Wow. Isn't that what we're just talking about?
Yeah.
And they've come down to us. And they began calling Barnabas Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. Hermes being a higher level god than Zeus. And he says here, the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gate and wanted to offer sacrifices with the crowds. I mean, wow, this was an elaborate thing that happened there. This was not a witnessing encounter that lasted a couple hours. This was a major event that was happening in the city. And he says, but when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of it, they tore their robes and rushed out into the crowd. Yeah, that's very interesting. So they obviously, blasphemy of blasphemies, that they would be elevated to godhood in the middle of these people. And in verse 15, it says, saying, men, why are you doing these things? We are also men of the same nature as you. Now, what's interesting about that word there, same nature, that's verse, what verse is that?
That's 15.
Verse 15.
Yeah.
That's 15. It's saying here, we're the same nature with you. The Greek word there is actually the word that means similar passions, pathos, where we get the doctrine of impassibility. Okay? And so it's interesting that Paul and James Dozal actually in his book points this very point out, that a key characteristics that distinguishes God and man is that unlike God, we are men of passions. I thought that was an interesting point. And then he says, and we preach the gospel to you. Here we go, parallel to book of Revelation, close parallel. And he says that you should turn from the vain things to the living God. Look at the rest of verse 15, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. Almost exactly what you get in the book of Revelation.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because they are not talking to people that have, watch this now, that have a framework for Christian language. They are pagan. And so if you immediately try to impress them with the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, they're just going to interpret those facts in a pagan fashion.
Yeah.
Of course, you understand, Micah, I'm sure everybody out there understands, in Greek mythology, the resurrection of gods was common.
Yeah.
Right? They believed that gods had resurrected prior to the resurrection of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So if Paul does not begin to formulate a particular vision of history for these Lycaonians, these men of Lystra, they're not going to be able to even interact with what Paul is talking about. And what I'm saying is this: as we fast forward to the vision and revelation, we are quickly, and depending on what context you're talking about, we are quickly facing an end time society that is so pagan that it needs the most basic building blocks of a worldview to understand the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the creator of all things, and subsequently his creation.
Mm-hmm.
The very same thing happens in Acts chapter 17 again, when Paul goes to Athens and he interacts with the Athenians once again. In Acts chapter 17, the Apostle Paul is going to have to reorient the Athenian philosophers back again to the creator of heaven and earth. That's verse 24. That's Acts 17, verse 24. But again, it's the same thing. Now, here, I just want to quote what G.K. Beale says. And so just a little quote here, if I may. He says here in the Book of Revelation commentary that he wrote in the NIGTC series, G.K. Beale says the angel's words then would be an exhortation to unbelievers to turn from idolatrous worship of creation to that of the creator. God is identified as the creator of all things as a motivation for people to worship him instead of creation. The verse could be analogous to Acts 14, verse 15, what we just read. We are preaching to you to turn from these vain idols to the living God who made heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In Acts 14:18, this notes that the audience continued in their idolatrous attitude, which also is the expectation in Revelation 14. Wow. So, Micah, what G.K. Beale is saying is that in Revelation 14, like what happens in Acts 14, the expectation on the part of the apostles is that humanity will continue in their pagan ways. Is that sobering or what?
Yeah, I mean, we've got some folks out there, some theologies that will say that we will all become perfect and then Christ will return. And I look at the Pentateuch and I read over and over and over again and all the early Old Testament, and I look and see, God said this, the people said, okay, we'll follow you, and then within a generation or even less, they're back to their old ways of not following God, not even remembering who that God is, and God having to come back down and say, well, he nicely smacks him on the head and says, hey, this is who I am. So I don't see this ending anytime soon.
Yeah, no, correct. And I think what you're talking about there is a bit of reality, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we can't become delusional or have delusions of grandeur in any sort of hyper eschatology where we think, in a sense, the kingdom of God is going to begin to just take over the world, and to the point where we end up becoming virtual universalists, believing that everyone will get saved. I personally, I just think that runs completely contrary to the sentiment of the Bible, to the apostolic doctrine, the apostolic pattern, and any verses that you can yank out of context, like in Isaiah, you are assuming that those passages are talking about a sort of realized eschatology in this world at a geophysical level, not simply talking about semi-realized eschatology redemptively in the heart of man, but then ultimately in terms of a physical kingdoms, the nations streaming in and a new world arising, that is not talking about the eschaton proper, the absolute end. And that is talking about the absolute end. And if we go back to Revelation 14 just for a second here, and I don't even know how long we've been going, brother, but I think it's important. We never do, right? We always lose track at this point.
It's somewhere close to an hour now.
Oh, okay. This might be a supersized exercise. Can you supersize this episode for me?
Yeah.
Because that's what we're headed at this point, right? But we just see that. Look, man, if G.K. Beale's right, if verse 8 goes on in a sense to demonstrate that even though the angelic message has sounded forth, and you can talk about, well, how is that going to look like? And what's that going to look like? Is there going to be an actual literal angel flying through the sky yelling at people? Does he have a bullhorn where he's yelling at the whole world about this gospel? Or is this angelic message a revelation of sort of the end time message coming through the church to the world? Probably. But if verse 8 is any indication that we are, in a sense, in Babylon, right? And what this is saying is that leading all the way up to the Parousia, we are looking at the great Babylon system. And so when he says here, Babylon, fallen is Babylon, and there he is quoting directly out of the book of Isaiah 21, and in other places, Jeremiah 51. But what John is then saying here is he's introducing the very concept that he's going to go on to develop in chapter 17 and 18 with the Babylon system, with all the nations of the world and all the leading, the great mighty men of the earth are going to give their authority over to this beast system and to the beast and submit to this beast system, at least for a time. What's really interesting is that doesn't last, but Revelation 17, 18, it goes on to kind of show that this all comes apart. This all falls to pieces in verses in Revelation 17, in verse 15 and following. What ends up happening is that these same earthly rulers end up turning on the Antichrist system, so to speak. This is what G.K. Beale calls the end time civil war, where in a sense, whatever system mankind develops, however technocratic it is, Marxist, socialist, liberal, whatever, economically oppressive, totalitarian, whatever that looks like, and I think something like the Roman Empire is a kind of a glimpse of that, right? At the 11th hour, it seems like it all collapses in upon itself. And then comes the judgment of the man of sin, of the Antichrist and his Antichrist system. So, I know at this point, Micah, we're in some really controversial territory. I know that a lot of people are just not going to agree with the eschatology. If you're post-millennial, you're definitely not going to agree. If you're premillennial, you will agree to a certain point. Some of you will think that the church has been raptured out of here by now. But at any rate, the point is this, is that what we're looking at with the reference to Babylon, Micah, is we're looking at a worldview distinction, one that is absolutely comprehensively pagan, so that the deepest antithesis imaginable arises between the worldview of the Creator and the worldview of utter paganism, because what is ancient Babylon if it is not synonymous with utter paganism? A pagan metropolis versus a theopolis, a city of God versus a pagan, a city of man. And therefore, we will have a complete worldview antithesis. And what do we see right now? We see exactly that. We see a total fundamental antithesis, like a wedge in between the biblical worldview and, brother, everything else. It doesn't matter if it's conservatism. It doesn't matter how red your state or your population or your city or your community is. If it is not biblical revelation rooted in the Word of God, the antithesis remains. I mean, how many examples do we need of this, Micah? Can you think of any? How about conservatives who say things like, we are fiscally conservative, but we are socially libertarian, let's say, for example. That is so common today, where you can have a conservative saying, oh, I subscribe to Judeo-Christian values. Absolutely. That has to do with things like free speech and personal rights and religious rights. But I also think that if a person, wants to marry somebody, who am I to tell them anything, right? Like, you should be able to marry whoever you want. I mean, that is not biblical Christianity.
Right.
That is not our worldview. So the antithesis is there. And so you have these two worldviews that are emerging. And what I'm saying is that what we learned from the last gospel is that only the doctrine of the absolute, transcendent, immutable creator will do. Everything else will fail, and everything else will align itself, to some degree or another, will align itself with the present evil age. That is a Babylonian, anti-Christ, anti-biblical, and fundamentally anti-Christian worldview. And you see that everywhere in the culture. And hopefully people will remember that as they seek to grapple with, how do we assess what's going on? Don't plug your finger in the cracks of the dam anymore. Understand the threat for what it is. Does that make sense, Micah, at all? Because I think without that, we're kind of lacking a big picture approach.
Well, I guess the one question I'd ask, it does make sense, but the one question I'd ask is, it seems like we don't have time to build a new wall or attack whatever's happening, and all we know how to do is put our fingers in the wall just to keep it just at bay. But what is it that we should be doing?
That's a fantastic question. Fantastic point. Jesus said, as the days of Noah were, so will it be in the coming of the Son of Man. And we know that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. And we know that these various eschatological moments in the history of redemption in the Bible are like little microcosms, little picture snapshots of what the final judgment will be. And we know, based on 2 Peter chapter 3, for example, that what happened in the flood is a prelude to what is going to happen at the eschaton. That the world was flooded by water, and Peter says the same world is being preserved, especially because of the Noahic covenant, being preserved for fire, so that in the end, God will reduce the world to a burning inferno of judgment, just like the world was drowned in judgment in the past. Now, there are some people that will want to tinker with that passage of scripture and say, no. That's only talking about, apocalyptic imagery, metaphorical imagery. It's just symbolic. There's no actual fire coming. There's no actual, burning of the elements and those kinds of things coming. And at this point, brother, that's a whole nother episode for me to say I completely disagree. But, even the ancient expositors, because a lot of people will try to point out, well, John Owen said that was referring to the destruction of the temple, the melting, the elements melting. And he points to Old Testament passages that seem to speak in the same way, and they weren't referring to the end of the world. So Peter's not referring to the end of the world. The problem is that even John Owen and others would say that whatever happened at 70 AD is nothing less than a a foreshadowing of what will happen at the end of time. So however much preteristic interpretation you can yank out of John Owen, he still has a futuristic eschatology, which is very interesting. But I just think that we are, as pilgrims, we are called to warn the world, and we are called to build up the church, and we are called to a ministry where we self-consciously envelop God's people, the elect, into the church of God, where in the church of God, they are brought into the household of God. They are brought into God's nation, God's people. They are made kings and priests unto our God. And the discipleship program very much looks like a church planting ministry, where we're building up local churches. It's interesting. Micah is in Acts chapter 14, the very passage that we've been looking at. In Acts chapter 14, in verses 19 and following, as you go all the way really to the end of really to verse 23, it's very interesting. But you ask, what do we do? And I would say, just do the same thing that Paul did, right? After Paul established churches, he appointed elders. Guess what he did, Micah? He moved on. He didn't seek to overthrow any institution. He didn't try to Christianize and what I call terraforming the culture for Christ. He planted biblical churches, and then he moved on. And are we to say that the Apostle Paul didn't do his Christian duty because he wasn't reconstructionist enough, let's say? No, absolutely not. But neither was the Apostle Paul a retreatist. Notice Micah, he went into the pagan culture. He didn't seek to retreat. He didn't look for a life of monasticism. He wasn't looking for a monastery up in the woods somewhere to get away from everything. No, he went into the very metropolis of paganism. He went into the centers of paganism, cities like Lystra and Athens. I mean, Corinth. We're talking about the very epicenter of ancient Roman paganism. And Paul went right into the heart of enemy territory to preach the gospel, plant churches, make disciples. And with that, God was pleased, and the Great Commission was fulfilled in the life of the Apostle Paul. He did not lack anything. And so I think as long as we do that, we'll be in good standing. If we follow the apostolic model, we serve in the local church. Maybe you're not a missionary. That's okay. Yeah. Serve in your local church. Build your local church up. Try to purify your church as much as possible. Build up those people around you. Strengthen the disciples around you, and you will be doing all that God requires of you in this crazy, zany technological world that we're living in today. And so I hope that people will derive some encouragement from that.
Yeah, I think that's good. I mean, so just to recap, I think it's just herald, be a preacher of the gospel in your own life and your surroundings, and then just get in and be discipled, either yourself or disciple others in your church of the gospel, of who God is, and the distinction between God and man and everything.
Yeah, there's a book that I would recommend to everybody, and maybe we can somehow put this up there eventually. But there's it's kind of an oldie but goodie. It's an oldie but goodie, okay? And it's a very, very practical book. I actually took my former church through that book, and man, I got to tell you, I want to come back to that book. It's so good. It's a book by Philip Ryken entitled "Courage to Stand." And what he's doing is he's teaching principles out of the book of Jeremiah. Because if you remember, Jeremiah, unlike Isaiah and other prophets, the book of Jeremiah is in Babylon.
Yeah.
Jeremiah is in Babylon. He's describing Babylonian captivity. He is surrounded by paganism. Okay. And yet, Jeremiah, what does he say? He says, build houses, have children, raise families, get married, seek the good of the city, because by seeking the good of the city, you too will prosper. And so it seems as if we find ourselves in a Babylonian captivity, we are to do good, seek the good of the city, but go on with your life. Don't be afraid. And I think right now, I can attest to this, Micah, maybe in a unique way because I'm a pastor, but other pastors have recently reached out to me in recent days, multiple pastors, of just how discouraged they are in ministry. They're ready to quit. When I was at the Shepherds Conference, oh man, I talked to numerous pastors that have been thrown under the bus. They've been run out of their churches. They've been beat down, discouraged, betrayed. People have turned on them. They've lost friendships. And man, I tell you, that experience is a dime a dozen in the church right now, so that the church is primed for massive encouragement. We need revival for pastors in the ministry in America, in this dystopian, technocratic kind of, world that we're living in right now, where it seems like after COVID, everything broke. I don't know if that would be too simple or general of an assessment, but it just seems after COVID, everything broke, and nobody wants to do anything anymore. And a lot of folks are downright discouraged. Now, I see a lot of glimpses of hope. I see a lot of great things on the horizon for a lot of ministry and church and things like that. But man, listen, Micah, what happens to COVID 2.0?
Yeah.
What happens when that happens? What happens when the cyber attack comes? And your neighbor's Tesla, God forbid, your neighbor's Tesla doesn't work anymore. What happens when we're in that kind of a world, and all of our gadgets no longer, don't do it for us anymore.
Right.
I mean, that can happen so easily. And so what I'm saying is that we need to be very, very prepared and equipped with this pilgrim mentality to remember this is not our home. We are strangers, aliens. We're passing through, just like Jeremiah was. And we seek for a better country, a lasting country, an enduring country. And so, man, I just wanted to end it, I guess, on that point right there.
Yeah.
That we need encouragement, desperately need encouragement today, both for pastors and church members and the local church and ministries. And so let's do that very thing, be in prayer for those around us. So
absolutely.
That's all I got. I hope people enjoyed this. Thank you guys very much for tuning in. Make sure and subscribe, share, and like the program. And also go over to Christ and Kingdom, our podcast, for all the different podcasts that we're doing there. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. Till next time, God bless.
God bless.